You already know this animal. You knew it before you could read. 7 tons of bone and muscle, a skull the length of a bathtub, 60 serrated teeth engineered to crush straight through the ribs of a triceratops.
Do what now?
And it's Tyrannosaurus rex, the tyrant lizard king.
Yeah.
For more than a century, it has held the undisputed title of apex predator of the late Cretaceous, the last great monster of the last great age of dinosaurs. But there's a skull sitting in a museum in Cleveland that has spent 40 years quietly trying to take the crown away. It is half the size, it is built for speed, and the world's best paleontologists have been in a bitter, personal, decades-long war over what it actually is. Is it a teenager going through an awkward phase, or is it something the king had to share its world with? The story starts in Montana, 1942, in a badland formation with a name that sounds invented for a documentary, Hell Creek. This is the last chapter of the dinosaur story, the final million years before the asteroid. And it is one of the best sampled slices of deep time on the planet. A fossil hunter pulls a small Tyrannosaur skull out of a rock and ships it back east. It sits, and it waits. In 1946, the paleontologist Charles Gilmore finally describes it. He looks at the narrow snout, the extra teeth, the delicate build, and he decides it is a species of Gorgosaurus, a slimmer tyrannosaur already known from older rocks. He calls it a Gorgosaurus lancensis. And then, for 42 years, almost nobody thinks about it again. Then 1988 happens. And who else but Robert Bakker, one of the most famous and most combative paleontologists alive, teams up with Michael Williams and Philip Currie and runs the skull through a CT scanner. They come back with the claim that lands like a grenade. This is not a Gorgosaurus.
Whoops.
This is not anything anyone has seen. The brain case looks fused. The sutures look closed. To their eyes, this is a small adult tyrannosaur, a compact, fast, sharp-toothed predator living in the shadow of the king. They give it a name that is almost a taunt, Nanotyrannus, the dwarf tyrant. And for a moment, the field is electrified because if it is real, the picture of Hell Creek changes completely. T-Rex is not alone at the top, it has a rival. But the celebration does not last because other researchers look at the same skull and see something very different. They see the texture of the bone surface, which in young animals is rough and porous and fibrous, like the bone is still under construction. They see proportions that match what you would expect from a growing tyrannosaur. Thomas Carr, a paleontologist who has spent his career mapping how tyrannosaur skulls change with age, publishes an analysis arguing that this is not a dwarf at all. It is a kid, a juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex.
Oh, come on.
Caught mid-transformation. And here's the thing you have to understand about tyrannosaurs. They did not grow up gently. They grew violently. A hatchling T-Rex was roughly the size of a turkey. A full adult was 9-ton animal with the strongest measured bite force of any land creature that had ever lived. To get from one to the other, it had to add thousands of pounds in a handful of years. The paleontologist Gregory Erickson built growth curves for these animals by counting rings inside their bones, the same way you'd count rings inside a tree. And what he found was a teenage growth spurt so extreme it sounds fictional, roughly 4 to 5 pounds a day, every day, for years. So of course a teenage Rex looked like a different animal, a slender, long-legged, narrow-snouted runner slowly inflating into a bone-crushing tank. That became the consensus, and it got a name that sounds a little complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. Ontogenetic niche partitioning. Ontogeny meaning growth. Niche just means job, and the idea is that one species filled 2 completely different jobs in its ecosystem, depending on how old it was. The kids chased, the adults crushed, same animal, 2 careers. It's a beautiful conclusion, ain't it? It explains a strange fact about Hell Creek, which is that the ecosystem seems weirdly empty of medium-sized predators. If juvenile rexes were doing that work, the gap closes. Then, in 2020, the case appeared to be shut for good. The paleontologist Holly Woodward and her colleagues took 2 of these small tyrannosaurs, nicknamed Jane and Petey, and did something that made the museum curators physically wince. They cut into the leg bones, because inside of a bone is a diary. It records how fast the animal was growing, and roughly how old it was when it died. Jane was about 13, Petey was about 15. And critically, the bone tissue looked like the tissue of an animal still in the middle of a spurt. Still building, not finished. Woodward's team published under a title that did not leave much room for negotiation, Growing Up Tyrannosaurus Rex. The dwarf tyrant was dead. Blech. The textbooks have been updated. Even the documentaries have been updated. If you looked it up at any point in the last few years, that is the answer you would have found. So why are we still talking about it? Because in 2024, Nick Longridge at the University of Bath and Evan Saita at the University of Chicago went back to those same growth rings and read them differently. Rings in a bone are not just a counter, they are a speedometer. When an animal is growing fast, the rings are spaced far apart. When growth slows down, the rings crowd together, packing tighter and tighter towards the outer edge of the bone, like the last lines of a signature running out of space. And Longridge and Saita argued that in these small tyrannosaurs, the rings were crowding. The growth was slowing. These animals were not in the middle of a spurt, they were near the end of it. So, naturally, they ran the numbers on where the growth curve was heading. Around 900 to 1500 kilograms, around 5 meters long, which is roughly 15% of the size of an adult T-Rex. Not a phase, a ceiling. But that creates a problem so big it almost sinks the whole idea. Where are the baby T-Rexes? Where are they? Because we have dozens of adult Tyrannosaurus specimens. If none of all the small Tyrannosaurs in Hell's Creek are juveniles, then one of the most collected dinosaurs on Earth has no childhood. And that, my friend, is not a gap. That is a hole big enough for a T-Rex to fall through. And then Longridge says something in an interview that's almost kind of funny. It turns out we found one. It had been collected years earlier, and it was put in a box of unidentified bones in a museum in San Francisco and forgotten about. A single skull bone from the roof of the head, with details that match Tyrannosaurus and do not match Nanotyrannus, from an animal about 5 meters long. One specimen, one bone. Sometimes one bone is enough. Sometimes it's nothing at all. That is the part that nobody agrees on. And then came the fossil that changed the temperature of the entire argument. In 2006 in Montana, commercial fossil hunters found something that sounds like a myth. A Triceratops and a small Tyrannosaur buried together, apparently locked in combat. The dueling dinosaurs. It should have been studied immediately. Instead, it disappeared into a legal war over who actually owned it. A fight that went all the way to the Montana Supreme Court. And for 14 years, the most important Tyrannosaur specimen on the planet was effectively locked in a vault. Untouchable, unstudied. In 2020, the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences acquired it, and in October of 2025, Lindsay Zano and James Napoli published their analysis in Nature. They had examined more than 200 Tyrannosaur fossils, and the small Tyrannosaur in the dueling dinosaurs, nicknamed Bloody Mary, was not a teenager. It was skeletally mature. Grown, finished. But the detail that really lands is the arms. Again, think about a T-Rex, right? It's big, it's got huge chompers, but it's got tiny, silly little arms. This small Tyrannosaur at the fraction of the size has bigger arms than a full-grown T-Rex. As Napoli put it, bones do not shrink when animals grow. Think about what that means. If this were a teenage Rex, it would have to have grown up by making its arms smaller. Its tooth count would have to have dropped. Its tail would have to have lengthened. Its entire pattern of cranial nerves and sinuses, the plumbing of its skull, would have to have rewired itself into a different configuration. That is not growth. That is a different animal. Zano and Napoli placed it in a whole new group, Nanotyrannus. Sitting outside the Tyrannosaurus family proper, not a young king, a distant cousin, and they took Jane, the specimen that was supposed to have ended the debate, and made it the type specimen of the second species. They named it Nanotyrannus letheus, after the river Lethe, the river of forgetting in Greek myth, because it had been sitting in plain sight, unrecognized for decades. So here's what's actually at stake, and it's much bigger than one dinosaur getting a name. For 30 years, researchers have been building the biology of Tyrannosaurus rex out of a pile of specimens, growth rates, bite force, brain structure, vision, running speed, population models, life expectancy, all of it assembled by treating the small ones and the big ones as the same animal at different ages. If Zano and Napoli are right, some of that data was never T-Rex at all. It was a different species mixed into the sample by accident, quietly distorting the curve. Then Zano straight up said, hey, you guys mixed two animals together on accident, and now those studies have to be re-examined. That is not a correction. That is a demolition. Now, is this over? No. and you should be suspicious of anyone who tells you it is. Jared Voris and colleagues have argued that the features used to place Nanotyrannus outside the Tyrannosaur family are exactly the features you would expect from an immature animal, which means the analysis could be measuring youth and mistaking it for ancestry. Christopher Griffin and colleagues went after the problem from a completely unexpected angle, examining the history of the hyoid, a small throat bone, as an independent test of maturity. Thomas Carr has not moved. Steve Broussat, who argued the juvenile position for years, has publicly acknowledged the strength of the new case, which in this field is kind of close to a confession. Yeah, this is what real science looks like from the inside. Not a textbook, a knife fight with citations. And there is one thing worth sitting with. Look at a photograph of yourself at 13, then look at yourself now. Different proportions, different face, different bones. If someone found only those two images with no context connecting them, would they be certain they were looking at one person? That is the exact trap. For 80 years, some of the smartest people who have ever studied fossils have been staring at two piles of bones, and the entire argument has come down to a single question. Is that the same creature at two ages, or two creatures at one moment? You sort the world this way constantly. You decide what is the same, what is slowly changing, and what is different entirely. We do it with people, with ideas, ourselves, but we're never asked to prove it. So look at that skull in Cleveland one more time. Half the size, built for speed, sitting in a drawer since 1942, waiting for someone to notice a difference. You did not already know this animal. You never did.